Let's set up a SQL Server AlwaysOn Availability Group. I'm just going to call it an AG from here on out. Before we get to the SQL stuff though, we're going to have to do a little preliminary infrastructure work. We're going to need to set up a Windows Failover Cluster. Now we don't have to set up all the shared storage or any particular cluster resources right now. All we need is a bare bones basic Windows cluster for the AG to use to do all its failovers. Once we get that done, we're going to install a SQL instance on each one of these servers, and the AG will refer to these instances as replicas. We're going to pick a primary replica, and then we're going to put a database on that replica. And we're going to stand up the AG, and that AG will take that database and synchronize it across the wire to the secondary replica or replicas if we have more than one secondary. The idea here being that when a user connects to the listener that we set up, which is a whole different network name that we create as part of the AG creation process, that listener will route to the primary replica. If something happens to that server providing that primary replica, then the secondary replica will take over as primary, and the listener will route to that one instead. Then we can fix whatever's wrong with the other server and fail it on back whenever we get things going. So let's jump into this and get this cluster made first. So I'm working with 3 servers in my environment. I'm working with a domain controller and 2 servers that I'll be installing SQL on, and they're going to be the ones that participate in my AlwaysOn Availability Group, or AG. I'm logged in currently to the SQL A node, and the first thing we need to do is create our failover cluster, and to do that we need to install the failover cluster feature. I've already done that on these servers, but I want to walk you through this process. So we're going to add roles and features. There's an introduction screen. We choose the role-based or feature-based. Next on that, I have a couple of servers in my pool. I'm going to choose the one I'm on, which is SQL A. And failover clustering is a feature, not a role. So I'm just going to skip past the server roles screen onto the features screen. Here's the features screen, and the feature you want is this failover clustering. There's no particular settings you have to worry about. It's all just next, next, next. So that's the one you need to install. And once you do that, in your server manager, up here at the top right hand side, we're going to see our menu here. If we choose the tools option, we're going to have this option pop up, Failover Cluster Manager. This is the one you want. So we're going to choose that, and that's going to pop up our Failover Cluster Manager MMC. And I accidentally clicked on it, and it's going to pop up 2 of these now and close one of them. Okay, so I've been playing with the Cluster Manager on these servers recently, and so it's not a fresh install of a Failover Cluster Manager. So one of the things that you need to do before you create a cluster is you need to do what's called validate configuration. So that just makes sure that all your hardware is there, all of your IP addressing is in place, and all the bits and pieces that need to be there to make a cluster are there and they're properly configured. Microsoft kind of requires that if you want support on your cluster. If you haven't done the configuration validation thing, they're going to be reluctant to give you any support. So make sure you do this. I'm going to walk you through this process even though I've already done it. So we're going to click that. We have an introduction screen. We're going to click next on that. So this is going to ask us which servers are participating in our cluster. Now, as I said before, we have 2 SQL servers, SQL A and SQL B, and they're in an Active Directory domain. So I'm just going to press the Browse button, and I'm browsing my domain. The servers are called SQL A and SQL B, so I'm just going to type the words SQL and check names to get any server that starts with those letters. Now, you see 3 here, A, B, and C. I'm using C for a different purpose later on. I just want A and B to be participating in my cluster. So I'm going to press OK on that. And then they are underlined, telling us that Active Directory recognizes those names. So press OK, and it's going to spend some time to validate that these servers are actually in the domain and all that mess. We are validated, and I'm going to press the next. This is going to ask us which tests that we want to run for our validation. Now, I mentioned a few minutes ago that we don't have to set up shared storage. So I don't want to run any tests that have to do with storage. I don't need storage in my cluster right now. So I'm not going to run all the tests. I want to run the ones that I choose. So that one and next. And so I'm going to untick the storage box, and there's another storage item inside the inventory heading. So I'm going to untick that one too. And press next. We got a summary screen to go through, make sure everything is what we chose. And we're going to press next. And we're going to let this thing run. I'm going to come back when it's done. Okay, that's done. So there are a couple of warnings that I can live with. Warnings about drivers and IP configuration. It's telling me that I don't have a heartbeat NIC, and these are lab servers. If I were in a production situation, I'd want a separate network for heartbeat to keep the cluster alive and things like that. But most of these things I can live with, software updates, whatever. So I'm just going to finish on this. You could check this box to create the cluster now, but I want to go through this manually. So finish on that, and now we are going to actually create the cluster. Click on this fella right here, create cluster. Okay, this is going to ask us which servers we're going to have participating in our clusters. The same thing from our validation screen. So once again, we're going to just type in SQL into our search box and choose the ones that we want to participate. I'm shift clicking on these, by the way. OK on that and OK on that. Once again, we're going to verify that the servers are there and they're part of the domain and all that stuff. Once that happens, we're going to next. This is asking us about the cluster name. It has to have a network name with an associated IP address in order to identify the cluster. So I'm going to call this SQL Cluster. And my subnet is here, 192.168.42, the answer to everything. And I'm going to give it 100. Okay, I'm going to pause for a second right here because there's something that needs to be in place before that network name can be created. This cluster wizard is going to try to register this name IP address combination in Active Directory and DNS. And if the user account that you are using right now to do this doesn't have those rights to create objects in Active Directory, this is going to fail. So let's have a look at the user account we are using. The user account is called DBA user. Okay, so this user is who has to have the rights in Active Directory to create things in the container where these servers are living. So let's swing on over to our domain controller up here. And we're going to open up Active Directory users and computers. Handily, I already have it open. And our SQL servers live in an OU called SQL servers, appropriately, right? So in our user accounts, we have our DBA user hanging out right here, and we have that user as a member of the group called SQL DBAs. So here's SQL DBAs, there's a DBA user, something else in there we'll cover later on. So I want to make sure that the DBA user has rights to create objects in the OU where our SQL servers are living. And I'm going to give that right to this group where this DBA user is living at. So in our SQL servers OU, I'm going to right click it and we're going to delegate control. And I'm going to next on that screen, and we're going to provide this right to the SQL DBAs group. Check names on that. Okay, so next. And the right we want to provide is to create computer objects, because the network name for the cluster is actually just a computer object. So we're going to have to thumb through this list here and find computer objects. So we see create and manage user accounts. We can scroll down, but I don't see create computer objects. So we're going to have to do a custom task. So if we look at here, custom task to delegate, we want this option right here. So I'm going to next on that, and I'm going to provide this right temporarily and then take it away once we've done everything with our AG and it's all set up and things. So I don't need to get too granular here. I'm just going to do the whole objects in this folder type selection here. And next on that. And we are going to create all child objects. So there's this little dude sitting right here. We want this object, create all child objects. So I'm going to take that selection and next. And here's our summary screen. Make sure we chose everything correctly and finish. So now we have given the DBA user and any other user in that group for that matter the rights to create objects in the SQL servers OU where our two SQL servers are living. So that should be enough rights to complete our wizard here back on our SQL server. I switched gears on you without telling you. Okay, so with that in place, we're back on our SQL server, and we have our SQL cluster name that we've chosen and our IP address to associate it with, and we are going to press next on that. So here is our summary screen. Once again, we do not have to have any shared storage in this cluster. So I'm going to untick the box to add all eligible storage to the cluster. It wouldn't add anything anyway because I have no eligible storage on these servers, so it wouldn't do anything. I'm just unchecking it for, I guess, house cleaning. So we're going to next on that, and we're going to let the progress bar finish, and I will come back. So that is done. We see our summary screen here. We have our two nodes, we have our cluster name, and we have our IP address. Finish on that, and now our cluster is created, and it should show up right under here. Now there's one more thing I want to do after I let this thing do its stuff. Okay, so we are clicked on the cluster on the left hand side here. We clicked on this heading right here, and we see all of the properties of the cluster. Now I want to expand this little arrow right here. We have all of these things. We have our cluster heading. We have these individual items right here we can look at. I am going to look at the nodes section. If we notice here, we have a lot of information we can look at. We have our server names, we have their status, we have assigned vote and current vote. Now what does all that mean? It's telling us about quorum. Clusters need to reach what's called a quorum, and that is essentially a majority vote. The nodes in a cluster will vote, say I'm here, I'm online, and as long as a majority of the nodes are online and voting, you have what's called quorum. You have a majority vote. So we have two nodes online, which means we have a majority. Why then do we see current vote 0 on one of these nodes? That is because we have an even number of nodes. Having an even number means that we can't have a real majority. Say if you had 4 nodes and for some reason 2 of them went down, and you only have 2 nodes voting, well, you have 2 nodes up and 2 nodes down. There is no majority there. You would need an additional vote, 3 of 4 instead of 2 of 4. We have 2 nodes, so we can either have 1 vote, 2 votes, or no votes. The only majority that exists in this scenario is 2 votes. That's the only time that we can have a majority. So we get dangerously close to having what is called split brain in a cluster, which means that the cluster doesn't know what to do whenever there's the same number of votes up as there are down. It doesn't know what to do. So we definitely don't want to have a split brain situation in which the cluster just freaks out and says, I'm done with this stuff. So what we need to do is give the cluster an additional vote so that we can have a majority, say 2 out of 3. So let's see how to do that. We're going to go back to our cluster heading here. And I am going to right click on this cluster heading and go to More Actions and Configure Cluster Quorum Settings. This is the option that I want right here. Once we get to the introduction screen, I'm just going to press Next. And this is where you can select the type of quorum votes you would like to have. I am going to choose the advanced option. Next. So all nodes are going to have a vote. All nodes that exist in our cluster are going to have a vote. And I'm going to configure what's called a witness. A witness is a thing that can provide an additional vote in your cluster. In my case, I'm going to use a file share type of witness because it's the easiest for me to set up at this point. So I'm going to press Next, and it wants the file share path. So come with me back over to our domain controller. In most situations, you would not want your domain controller providing a file share witness. The only other server I have in my network right now. And I am going to open my File Explorer. And I've already made a folder on my C drive called Cluster Witness. And what I am going to do is right click on that Cluster Witness folder and choose Properties and go to Sharing. I'm going to share it with Advanced Sharing as the name Cluster Witness, and we're going to do Permissions. Now, in my situation, I've given the Everyone group. You might lock that down in an actual production environment. And in the Security section, I'm going to give permissions to not only the SQL DBAs group we looked at earlier, but I'm going to add one more thing to that. I'm going to add the computer name belonging to the cluster. So that is, in our case, SQL cluster, and computer names end with a $sign. But if we look up here, this says users, groups, and built-in security principles. We need to put computers in this list here so it finds the name SQL clusters. This is a computer name. So I'm going to choose object types, and I'm going to choose computers out of this list here. Then we can check on click on the Check Names button, and that should underline SQL cluster for us. We need to be able to write to this folder. So I don't want modify really at this point. So OK on that, close on that. And now we have a shared folder that we can access across the network, and that is the permissions allow not only our DBA user to access it, but the cluster itself can access that shared folder. So Once again, we're going to go back over to our main SQL node, and we're going to browse to that path. So I'm just going to click the Browse button, and we're going to go to our DC01 server. And here's our cluster witness folder. There we go. There's our shared UNC path if you want to get a closer look at that. And press Next on that. Here's our summary screen. And if all is well with our settings and our permissions, this wizard should complete with no problems. Okay. We have a message here. You have successfully configured the quorum settings for the cluster. So I'm going to finish on that. And we see in this screen, in our main cluster screen now, we have our SQL cluster and we have our file share witness. And it shows to be online. So now, if we look at back on our nodes here, now if we look at all these values again, we see that our current vote, each server now has a full vote in the cluster because we have an odd number now. And we can lose one of these, and we will still have the other server casting its vote and our file share witness casting its vote for a total majority of 2 out of 3, and our cluster keeps running. So now we have our cluster set up, and the next step is going to be to install SQL on our SQL servers. And I'll do that in the next video.